And I'm Kyle Clifton. I'm the social science research coordinator in the Human Dimensions Lab at Oregon State University. And I get to work with a lot of great folks at Puget Sound Partnership and other recovery partners associated with the partnership, including folks at Industrial Economics and UW's Puget Sound Institute. And we are co-hosting this webinar series on motivating behavior. So there's one more session in the series. This is the second of three. And the motivation behind this motivating behavior series was really bought from human dimensions needs that were articulated by folks in the recovery community. And sometimes that was through kind of formal planning processes, sometimes more informal, unstructured discussions and conversations. And then some of these needs are also captured in the GUM, which is the Grand Uncertainties Matrix, which is organized and managed by folks at PSI, Puget Sound Institute. And a number of the items on the GUM or that have been brought up through other planning processes that might not be included in the GUM are generally how do we get people to behave differently? And that comes in a lot of different contexts and flavors, but that's generally the overarching theme. And so we organized this series as just kind of a sharing and networking opportunity to address some of those human behavior challenges that are coming up in Puget Sound recovery work. And the session today is a light touch on science and strategy that we really hope is presented in a way that's understandable and useful for y'all who are able to join today or maybe watching the recording. And so I'm joined today by Megan Jones, who's also in the Human Dimensions Lab at Oregon State University, as well as the USGS Oregon Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. And then also Raye Evrard, who is with Puget Sound Institute at UW. And we're happily supported also by Mara Flight, who's with Industrial Economics or IEC. I want to kind of kick things off today with just some rules for engagement of how we can best interact with each other during this session. This main session is recorded. However, later in our session today, we'll have more of an open group discussion, so a little more of a two-way discussion after the presentations. And we may get to some breakout rooms to continue that discussion. And so those kind of more two-way conversations will not be recorded, just so that everyone feels, if anyone has a little stage fright, no one feels uncomfortable speaking up. We would love to hear from you. And please use the chat for any questions or comments, especially during the presentation. And so let's go ahead and I know we're already in the afternoon, but do a little dusting off the keyboard and practice using the chat today. So please do not send yet. So don't send, but draft your response in the chat of what is a challenge or ongoing area of your work that's relevant to today's motivating behavior session. So kind of a general, why are you interested in this? What brought you here today? So don't send it yet. I'll prompt you to send it later, but go ahead and draft that while I keep going through these engagement guidelines here. So after our presentation portion, we will pause for just some Q&A about the information that was presented in the presentations. And at that time, you can absolutely still use the chat, but you can also use the raise hand function in Zoom, which is probably on the bar at the bottom of your screen, but it might be on the bar at the top of your screen, depending on if you've moved that bar around on accident or on purpose. And so you can definitely ask questions that way during the Q&A and when we get into the general discussion as well. So if you've drafted your response to what is a behavior challenge or ongoing area of your work that's relevant to today's motivating behavior session, if you've got that locked and loaded, go ahead and hit send and we'll get a nice waterfall of responses in the chat. while I walk us through the agenda. So happily, I'm wrapping up this introduction and we can move on to the meat of things. And so as kind of an on-ramp, I'm going to briefly talk us through what's called the information deficit model. Which is just kind of an understanding or assumption that a lot of us hold about how we can affect behavior change. And then transition to introducing a framework called the COM-B framework. So I'll introduce that alternative framework that can be more effective at influencing behavior change, and then hand the baton to Megan, who's going to really kind of get into the meat of the components of that framework by using an example from her work. So using an example to talk through those framework components. Then we'll have Raye, who's going to introduce the incentives catalog that was created by PSI, Puget Sound Institute, and use examples from that incentive program catalog to again kind of walk through some of the components of the COM-B framework using existing examples of programs that are in the Puget Sound and I think maybe beyond, but I think the examples today are all Puget Sound relevant. Then we'll have that pause. So we'll get to the Q&A, and once we're ready, we're gonna turn off the recording and then really transition into the group discussion. So we get to have a little more back and forth with y'all. And that's where the responses that you just sent in the waterfall in the chat, we might draw upon some of those to help guide our discussion. And depending on how that discussion goes, we might break it down a little and take that discussion into breakout rooms for just smaller group discussions that go through workshopping a particular behavior change need using that COM-B framework. So that's where we're at today, and I'll go ahead and get us on that on-ramp of the information deficit model.
Before you jump into that, Kyle, if I may sort of summarize some of the things I'm hearing, thank you all for dropping in the chat. We've got folks who are talking about some like specific behavioral domains like boating behavior, riparian planting. We've got people switching from gas to electric. We've also got people talking about different audiences like private landowners, rural residents, their team or at their agency. And we've got people talking about different like high level challenges around the difference between social science or social marketing, trust building, when behaviors are not visible. So it's hard to build a social norm around that. So please feel free to there's some really rich themes here. So please feel free to keep dropping things in the chat that are relevant. If you haven't yet added to the chat aspects of your work that brought you here today, we'd love to hear from as many people as are willing to share. So thanks, Kyle, for letting me jump in.
Oh, of course. I'm glad you did. Thank you. Okay, so for real this time, I'll take us on the on-ramp of what a lot of us might be familiar with in concept, if not in name, which is the information deficit model. So this is the idea that I think many of us would love to be really, it seems elegant, it seems simple, it seems rational, and it might even seem inexpensive, which is always a good practical consideration in the work that we do. And so this is that, if people only knew why the undesirable behavior was undesirable, or if they knew about this preferred behavior and maybe the why behind it, then surely they will action that behavior. So that's where there's an identified behavior change need. The expert, card carrying, hat wearing expert shares information with the individual or the audience more broadly that whom behavior they want to influence. And the recipient or recipients hear that behavior just as it's been delivered to them by the expert, and they hear it and they adopt it. They take it on as true fact and as something that they can action, and they then change their behavior. And so this is neat, this is clean, this would be fantastic. And unfortunately, a large body of work shows that this is really only sharing information is really only effective at influencing behavior change in a small minority of contexts and populations. So in general, we need something more, right? And some of the reasons that this model does not work is how we can understand what we need to do better. So first, there's a filter of sorts, I'll call it a filter, that impedes the way that the information is received by the intended audience. So these can be components of identity, of existing beliefs of what the audience knows, so what they believe to know to be true. It can be trust with the information sharer, or maybe other partners or individuals with whom they need to interact to understand more or enact the behavior. So that can really affect the audience adopting the information as it's shared by the expert. And furthermore, there's this kind of second filter that can hinder the behavior change, potentially even if the information is otherwise adopted as intended by the expert. And these are components of capability of the individual or individuals, opportunity to perform the behavior, and motivation to perform the behavior. And so, because we have these sticking points, because we have these, I'll call them filters, this model very often is not effective at influencing behavior change. But we can identify some of these levers that maybe we can push. And so that brings us to the COM-B model. So COM-B is an acronym. I feel confident that this audience lives in a very acronym-heavy world. So here's another one you can add to your library of acronyms in all of the work that y'all do. So COM is for capability, opportunity, and motivation. And B is that behavior. They're on the right side of the model here. So by capability, we mean the knowledge, the skills, mental state, abilities. And so these can be both physical or psychological and/or psychological. By opportunity, these are more external factors that can make the behavior possible. This can be something to do with the individual or the population's environment. And so that can be a physical environment or a social environment. The social environment is really important because we're social folks, right? And then the third component is motivation. And so by this is more of that internal process that can influence decision making, and especially around a behavior. And this can be reflective. So you can be very aware of this decision making process as it's happening. And sometimes it's a lot more automatic. So it's not, front of mind conscious decision making thoughts or process that's rattling around in your brain. And so behavior change is motivated by modifying at least one of these components. And if we approach understanding how to support behavior change using this model, it can be really helpful to understand, again, what specific kind of levers we can push to influence behavior. So it's really useful when we're trying to consider or develop intervention methods that can affect behavior change. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Megan so she can walk us through some of these components from using an example from her research.
Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, just to underscore sort of where COM-B comes from as well, if you have been reading at any point the conservation behavior change literature, the peer-reviewed literature, you might have come across things like the theory of planned behavior, which I would say that COM-B is starting to supersede. I hope it continues to supersede theory of planned behavior because it is in many ways more flexible, more adaptable, and more comprehensive than that theory. And COM-B was created out of health psychology as an effort to synthesize a lot of existing theories of behavior. Because again, if you've engaged with behavioral science, probably have come across the fact that there are many different theories that explain different parts of human behavior. And it can be kind of overwhelming to know where to start or how to how to wrap your head around all the different pieces. So I kind of think of COM-B as one theory to rule them all, and giving you both a high level umbrella of, like, if you remember nothing else, capability, opportunity, and motivation are all necessary for behavior. And then as you're starting to get into the nitty gritty of evaluating your context and thinking about behavioral design, you can unpack these smaller boxes that are nested within each of those high level umbrella categories. So with that, it does often, I think, help to think through these specificities through an example. And I wanted to bring in an example from research that I've just done recently with my postdoc, Brian Erickson, about human-beaver coexistence in Oregon. So the research question that we set out to answer was, how are practitioners communicating with private landowners about human-beaver coexistence behaviors? This was based in Oregon, but I know that across the Pacific Northwest, beavers are being both championed and grappled with, maybe both on the landscape and in our minds, are in terms of both their potential to help mitigate or things like drought or create wildfire resilience, potentially add benefits for water storage on the landscape and forage for livestock, but they also have and habitat creation for other animals and other species, but they also have these costs that are borne by the people who live on the land or who work the land, related to infrastructure damage, property damage, and even just damage to things that are aesthetically pleasing. And so we were trying to understand, like, how are practitioners engaging with landowners around this? Because beavers are coming back into a changing landscape in terms of having been extirpated in many parts of their range. They're now recovering, which is exciting, but then there's also all these human factors on the landscape that pose new challenges. So how can we live in a changing world alongside beavers is kind of like a mega level question that a lot of folks are grappling with. And there's a lot of practitioners in Oregon working on this issue. This diagram here was created by a group in Oregon to capture some of the organizations that are working on this issue. So from us as a research perspective, it was a real opportunity to learn from on the ground practice and try and build from the bottom up this framework of how are people engaging different private landowners, and like, what do they see as their best practices that could then be used by other people and sort of systematized. So what Brian did is he interviewed 23 practitioners over a 6-month period about how they communicated with private landowners about either mitigating conflict with beaver or restoring habitat for beaver, like the two sides of the coin, right? You need places for beavers to live, and you also need them to be able to not get into conflict with humans when they're there. And as we were doing this iterative qualitative data analysis, and we were kind of overwhelmed by the number of things that practitioners were talking about or reported talking about with private landowners. And through that process of trying to synthesize all those different themes, we realized that COM-B was actually really useful for making sense of what practitioners were paying attention to, both in terms of what they emphasized in their communication, but also what they were listening to in their conversations and interactions with private landowners. So that's really our first finding from this research, is that COM-B makes sense of not just what you might say to a landowner, but also what you might listen to them saying. And practitioners are listening for capability, opportunity, and motivation just as much as they're trying to emphasize it in their outreach and engagement. So this quote here on the screen is one practitioner sort of summarizing that up. Quote, "At the core of any kind of communication is really trying to listen and understand how this property owner is affected by beavers based on that activity. And then that will help, hopefully, guide a solution or some alternative to lethally removing them." So at the heart of communication, of COM-B communication, is this dynamic back and forth, these iterative interactions, either just in a single conversation or often for practitioners over a series of weeks, months, or even years of interaction with private landowners, trying to figure out where they're at in terms of capability, opportunity, and motivation, and what they need to support those different things moving forwards. So if we unpack each of those in succession, we'll start with capability. So going back to some definitions here, The creators of this framework talk about physical and psychological capability. This is often glossed as skills and knowledge, and I personally find that a little more helpful to wrap my head around in terms of like, for every behavior, any behavior that any of us does, we need to know that it's possible. We need to know how to do it. We also need to have the skills to be able to do it and that physical ability to be able to take that action. So we found both of these dimensions, both skills and knowledge, in our human beaver coexistence data. So again, practitioners are listening for this information and sharing this information in their communication, or at least that's what they told us. So for example, quote, "The landowner perception I run into a lot is that when beavers show up, people think, oh no, a pest has moved onto my property. And as a good steward of the land, it's incumbent upon me to make sure that pest is gone. So then when I get called out, I put on my wildlife biologist hat and I help folks see that beavers aren't necessarily a pest. So in some situations, it actually is helpful to give people knowledge if they are misclassifying wildlife as pest as opposed to ecologically beneficial. It might be that simple, but you kind of have to listen to, is that where the landowner is coming from? On the other hand, the quote on the right of the slide is an example of people sharing more skills-based communication with landowners. So one person said, quote, "A lot of these private landowners out in Eastern Oregon, they're very much do-it-yourselfers and they innovate all the time. One of the things that I learned even from that installation with this guy was this guy knows more about fencing than I do. We actually got him thinking about the solutions. I tried to bring him into the situation. I said, quote, we need a flashing back there. You create it. And then he checked in with me. So I think that it really drew him into the process. So this practitioner is like giving the task over to the landowner because that's where the landowner wants to, like the skills that the landowner has and wants to execute and the autonomy they want over their process. The second part of COM-B is the opportunity piece. And again, the original framework uses this language of physical and social opportunity. We used in our research talked about social and ecological opportunity because that's kind of a social ecological systems framework, fits more with a lot of the work that goes on in our space. So social opportunity, you can think about like the norms of the community that people are living in, like with beavers, what do their neighbors think? They also include in this model like formal legal rules under social opportunity, like what's actually legally possible here. And also are there kind of cues coming from their social environment that might remind them of this? And then with ecological and physical opportunity, like, is this a landscape that could support beavers? Do the landowners have the resources they need to take conflict mitigation or habitat creation behaviors? So we found both of those things again in our data in terms of the dynamic communication happening between practitioners and landowners. So this quote on the left talks about trying to map out on the land where it's okay for beavers to be in the role of ecosystem engineer and where do humans want to retain the role of ecosystem engineer. So once everyone's established a border, there's this sigh of relief because we can now have plans. So creating kind of ecological zones that are human dominated and beaver dominated. So this is the opportunity area for beaver coexistence, basically. And then the second quote is really emphasizing the use of social normative language, although I don't know if the practitioner would have said it in that jargony way, but they said that, quote, usually I mention road crews and municipalities across North America have switched to doing this because they end up saving money. You might pay a little bit more now than hiring a trapper, but over the period of 10 years, it'll be an order of magnitude cheaper. So really reinforcing other people are doing this, you can join them. The third and final part of COM-B is motivation. And again, this language of reflective or automatic motivation covers a whole lot of different pieces. In terms of reflective motivation, this is like the conscious stuff, like your goals and intentions, and also your beliefs about consequences. So if I do this, I think X will happen. And then automatic motivation, I think it's easiest to think about emotions as a really obvious example of this. Like, how do I feel about the behavior? What's sort of the vibe that I associate with this behavior? Again, we found in our data that beaver practitioners were thinking about these things in their exchanges with landowners. So when they were having a conversation at someone's property, they were often listening for things like, what do the landowners want to create on the landscape? Is that like water storage? Is that forage? And what do they want to protect in terms of things like keeping working lands in production, maintaining property and infrastructure? These are the guiding goals that any kind of conflict mitigation or habitat restoration activity needed to support, needed to be in service of these goals that the landowners had. And then they're also sharing with the landowners about helping the landowners maybe recalibrate their beliefs about consequences. So this first quote illustrates that when I'm working with the landowners, what they're craving for the most part is stability. And I'm just trying to help them come up with a strategy going forward where the beaver activity is predictable and they're not going to run into instability that blindsides them. Some of you on the call who are familiar with beaver behavior might say beavers aren't predictable. And that I think is really important nuance that did come out from our practitioners of helping people plan for unpredictability can itself be a form of predictability. So even just believing that I will know, I have a sense of what could happen. Therefore, I feel more confident living with a beaver on my land because I know the range of things that could occur. So I'm more relaxed about this situation. And then the second quote also kind of leans into that emotional component of motivation, where, quote, people want to feel like they're getting taken care of. If someone feels like you're on their issue and you're helping them, they may even be satisfied without you getting them any results. So just the feeling of having a collaborator, having a partner, having someone you can turn to and you can call. People talked about having, being someone who will pick up the phone when a landowner calls if there's a beaver issue as a form of motivation that can make someone want to stick with it across a restoration process, which, as y'all know, can often take quite a long time to come from design all the way through to implementation. Or even if there's some sort of emergent beaver challenge as you try and mitigate conflict one day and then 6 months later something else happens. This is a dynamic system. So I want to leave you with this invitation to think about listening for themes of capability, opportunity, and motivation in your interactions with your audiences, because that's really where our research participants started, is with listening and trying to gather this information in order to match their programming, their own outreach and education and edge engagement to where the audience was already at, rather than assuming that people need motivation because maybe they already are strongly motivated, or maybe they maybe they needed to pivot to talking to totally different audiences that actually were in a position to have an opportunity to act. So listening and learning where your audience is at and figuring out which of these pieces they maybe need the most support. So I look forward to talking through this more in the discussion, and I'm going to hand it over to Raye.
Wow, thank you so much, Megan. I just learned so much. That was fascinating. My goodness. Hi, everyone. My name is Raye Evrard. I am a research scientist from the UW Puget Sound Institute. So, unlike my other presenters here, Kyle and Megan, I do not really have a strong background in behavioral sciences, but I have touched on incentives. And so earlier this year, my colleagues Chris Wright, who also worked on this project with me, and Amy Kinney were asked to create a payments to landowner incentives catalog. And we were asked by the Department of Ecology and Stormwater Center to sort of create this. And the purpose was to identify currently existing programs within the Puget Sound region that provide financial incentives directly to landowners in order to implement stewardship activities. And so within this catalog, there are some incentive programs that might be excluded. And those include some intermediary incentives. So those incentives not really directly impacting the landowner, non-financial incentives, or non-private landowner incentives. So that's like there are no developer incentives included within this catalog. So we last updated this catalog in January of 2025. I think we started working on it about fall of 2024. So some of the data might be a little old. It's been about 9 months since I popped back in there and updated it. but I did include here a QR code that would take you to the catalog. And if there are any programs that you know of that you don't feel are in there and should be in there, feel free to reach out and let us know, and we can add those in. Currently, there are 59 incentive programs, and they cover a nice variety of topics. So we have agriculture, forestry, habitat, that's sort of where the shoreline ones will be, restoration focused, septic, and stormwater. And most of these, if not all, are going to sort of cover that opportunity of the COM-B framework because they are helping to remove or lessen that financial barrier that can be included with some of these stewardship activities we would like them to see. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples, but also sort of dive in and let you see what the catalog also includes. So this is examples of what you might see in the catalog. All of these columns will be in there, but this is not an extensive view of what is included in the catalog. Along with these columns, we also describe the funding organization and the geographic scope, as well as the operational history of the program, if it's ongoing, operating since, if it's been a pilot, and a sort of the funding description that is actually funding the incentive program, if it's funded by fees, grants, or a private donor. And it will also include links to the program itself. Included within the catalog, we also have a separate README tab that provides definitions for the type of financial incentives and a description for each of the columns included. And so, for instance, here you'll see that 2 of the examples I put in both offer rebates. A rebate is a specific type of financial incentive where the implementing organization, that's the one who is providing the incentive, provides payment to the contractors with no upfront cost or reimbursement required by the landowner themselves. So they're getting that sort of automatic discount. And I chose these 3 incentive programs to focus on today. So we have Savvy Septic, Rain Garden Program, and the Septic to Sewer Rebate. Uh, I decided not to include some of the shoreline ones because if you listened into part 1, we had a good focus on shoreline arboring with their shore-friendly program, which is fantastic, and I highly recommend going back and taking a listen if you haven't. And then in part 3, my colleague Chris Wright will be heading that one, and he's going to be talking a little bit about riparian work. And so I decided to highlight some of the incentive programs that might have been missed, which include septic and stormwater. And so the Savvy Septic, by the way, it is Septic Week. So if you have a septic system, go out and get it maintained. This is the week to do it, just highlighting that. But this is a program out of Snohomish County Health Department. Oh, actually, if you could go back, Kyle. Thank you. And they are there to educate homeowners on the different financial options to update and maintain their OSS. And the audience for this program is Snohomish County, specifically the Stillaguamish watershed. And Stillaguamish watershed is a MRA, which is a marine resource area. So that means that there are shellfish nearby that need extra protection from these septic tanks. And they offer rebate grants or loans, but also an educational component with workshops. And this is a 10-year-old program and has seen a good amount of success. They have over 1,000 rebates, grants, and loans issued over the past 10 years. Over 800 people have attended the workshops, and they have helped to fix 6 septic tanks from failure. And failure is when that raw sewage is just going out in the environment, and we don't want that. And then we have the Rain Garden program, and this is out of Linwood. And they provide this sort of technical assistance to homeowners who want to install a rain garden. And anyone in Linwood is eligible for this incentive program. And this is sort of a neat program, I think, whereas instead of offering some sort of loan or grant, it's sort of like the homeowner doesn't need to do a certain payment. All the homeowner needs to do is pay for the cost of the plants, everything else, the cost of labor, the cost of design for the rain garden. That's all done by the city of Linwood itself. And they have about 10 projects per year. And then we have the septic to sewer rebate. And this is out of the Lock Clean Water Alliance, and that's Lacey Olympia Tumwater. And they offer 50 to 75% off for the connection fee if you wish to convert your home that's previously on septic to the public sewer system. And this can be a pretty expensive endeavor. And so that's a nice discount to have. And this is for all the property owners within the lot area. And this system has continued throughout the years. It started in 2017, it's continuing on through 2024, and has seen participation throughout each of those years. And an ERU is an equivalent residential unit. It's like kind of a common way of how water and sewer is measured for your water and sewer bill. You know, isn't that's not really that important, but in case you were curious about it. And next slide. So focusing in on Savvy Septic and sort of how these programs connect to the COM-B framework. And this has been a really nice exercise for me because I wasn't that knowledgeable in the COM-B framework before this, and now I feel pretty capable in it. And so what I found was that each of the incentive programs touch upon a component within the COM-B framework. They all touch upon capability, opportunity, and motivation. But the ones that I decide to choose are these examples I feel have sort of a stronger link to one of those components. And so for Savvy Septic, I thought it had a nice link to the capability component because of offering that sort of education to help homeowners with their decision making and understanding of the problem. So it's boosting that psychological capability through those workshops and through those newsletters. It's not just saying to the homeowner, hey, you need to maintain your septic tank. It's saying, hey, maintenance is important for these reasons, and this is how you do it. These are the finances that can help, and these are where you can go. And then they can offer up those loans, rebates, and grants to the homeowner. And so it's not just a financial part, it's also an educational component working together. And then we have the Linwood Rain Garden program, which is on the next slide. Thank you. And this program I thought linked well with opportunity. And I thought this was such a different program in that instead of providing sort of or asking what resources or time the person will need to install the rain garden, it's sort of eliminating that. It's being like, we will give all the resources needed to make this rain garden. We will put in the time. All you need to do is help us supply the plants. And I think it's cool the collaboration that's occurring within Linwood. So they collaborate with the Master Gardens who help to design the rain garden. And then they also collaborate with the Veterans Conservation Corps, who are actually the ones going in and putting in the garden. And so if there's a physical barrier to getting a rain garden within that you want, this really helps to remove that, and it helps us also with the social opportunity of seeing all these beautiful rain gardens being put up throughout Linwood, and then other people might be like, I want that too. And you can like talk to your neighbors about it and spread the word. And then for the final example, we have the lot septic to sewer rebate. And I thought this was a nice example of motivation because it has sort of that instant discount component where the rebate or a good portion of the cost for that connection fee is paid through lot themselves. And so unlike with the reimbursement where you have to pay that full price upfront, and these connection fees can be pretty pricey. And so a homeowner might not be able to afford that connection fee at the full price. And so being able to be like, you don't have to pay that full price, you can pay a 50% or 75% off. It really might be the link to getting the landowner or the homeowner that sort of motivation to make the switch over to sewer. And so those are the three examples I have. I think we're going to move on now to our Q&A portion of the workshop, and I'll pass it back to Kyle. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. So I just pulled back up our agenda here just so we can recap. So we've talked through the information deficit model, the COM-B framework, through the Beaver example that Megan provided, and then we've got the incentives program catalog with more examples happily to help us tell the story and provide examples on COM-B framework in action. And so we're at the portion now for just Q&A, especially if you have questions for any of us who presented on what we presented, on what we chatted through today. And then we can, after that, move into group discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so I can actually see you guys a little better. I always feel like I'm flying blind when I share my screen, which might be relatable for some folks. So I'm going to stop sharing here and pause. And so I can actually see the chat. And this is also a great time. If you have any questions, you can always use the raise hand feature in Zoom and ask away, or you can type them right into the chat.
We were just too comprehensive. We answered all the questions before they could think of them.
Trying to respect the silence here. If a question or thought is being formed currently. Okay, I think we might then move on to group discussion. So I think at this point, just so that we can bring up our ideas and feel comfortable chatting through them, I think we'll go ahead and end the recording for the session today. So those of you who are tuning in asynchronously, thank